What I'm saying is we can stop them from leaving. We have to stop them from leaving. And that's a big, big factor.
Some industries are starting to feel the belt tightening because of President Trump's tariffs.
More fallout from Trump's tariffs. Automaker Stellantis is temporarily halting production.
In just the first 5 months of 2025, more than 90,000 American workers have been laid off, not from automation or outsourcing, but from the cascading fallout of a renewed trade war. General Motors, Stellantis, UPS, and Volvo have each announced major job cuts, citing rising production costs, global supply chain volatility, and the mounting impact of retaliatory tariffs. The original message behind these policies was familiar: protect U.S. industry, bring jobs home, hold foreign competitors accountable. But the outcome looks very different on the ground. Instead of creating security for American workers, these measures have triggered a new wave of economic instability, one where the hardest hit aren't abroad, but here at home. These job cuts, concentrated in logistics and automotive sectors, are a direct signal of sector-wide contraction now underway. UPS alone has laid off over 20,000 workers, citing rising international shipping costs and cross-border delays tied to tariff disputes. General Motors has slashed thousands of assembly and parts manufacturing jobs while also warning investors of up to $5 billion in tariff-related losses this year. Volvo has cut 800 positions from its U.S. operations, and Stellantis has imposed hiring freezes and rolled out early retirement buyouts, explicitly linking those decisions to mounting trade uncertainty. These are not isolated corporate adjustments or short-term cost trims. They're direct, large-scale responses to a policy shock that's disrupting logistics, squeezing supply chains, and draining confidence from the very sectors these tariffs were meant to protect. And for workers on the ground, the promise of revitalized American industry is quickly being replaced by pink slips and shrinking prospects. The economic impact of the renewed trade war is no longer hypothetical. It's carved directly into corporate earnings reports and investor briefings.
Well, when we look at the overall $4 to $5 billion impact from tariffs that we shared.
In May 2025, General Motors cut its full-year earnings forecast by as much as $5 billion, explicitly citing the escalating cost burden from tariffs on imported vehicles, parts, and components, Reuters. The move sent an immediate chill through the auto sector. For an industry already operating on tight margins and long planning cycles, the message was clear. Uncertainty is no longer a risk. It's the baseline. In the months that followed, other major automakers began scaling back their U.S. strategies. Plans to expand domestic electric vehicle production, once touted as the future of American manufacturing, were delayed or shelved entirely. Capital earmarked for new plants in states like Michigan and Georgia was quietly redirected to offshore investments or frozen altogether. Ford and Stellantis, among others, pulled their forward guidance, citing policy-driven volatility and the growing impossibility of making accurate financial projections in a trade environment shaped by politics rather than predictability. These decisions aren't strategic rebrands or minor course corrections, they are survival strategies. Companies are not retreating from innovation or demand. They're retreating from risk they can no longer manage. When the rules change mid-game and supply chains are taxed without warning, long-term planning collapses. And in the world of large-scale industry, if you can't plan, you can't build. If you don't build, you don't hire. If you don't hire, the story of American industrial renewal becomes just that, a story. The losses now stretch beyond GM. Analysts estimate that the ripple effect of these shifts could collectively shave up to $90 billion in market value across the U.S. auto and logistics sectors by year-end, a staggering figure that reflects not just lost profit, but lost faith in the U.S. as a stable industrial base. Executives are increasingly describing the U.S. manufacturing climate as hostile to investment, not due to labor costs or regulation, but due to economic policy that changes direction faster than companies can adapt. This is no longer just a fight over tariffs. It's a question of whether the country's most critical sectors, from EVs to logistics to advanced manufacturing, can operate at scale in a system that punishes long-term strategy. And right now, the answer for many corporations is no. In early 2025, the Trump administration introduced a sweeping 25% tariff on all imported cars and auto parts, marking one of the most aggressive trade policy moves since the original tariff war began years earlier. The measure didn't discriminate. It applied not only to geopolitical rivals like China, but but also to longtime allies, including Canada, Japan, Germany, and Mexico.
We're going to bring thousands and thousands of businesses and trillions of dollars in wealth back to the good old USA.
It was pitched as a bold step toward defending American industry, protecting domestic jobs, and restoring self-reliance in manufacturing. But what followed was a wave of disruption that cut deeper and wider than even its critics had anticipated. Production costs spiked almost overnight, especially for automakers deeply embedded in global supply chains where components often cross multiple borders before final assembly. With everything from brake systems to semiconductors now subject to the new tariff regime, companies were suddenly forced to absorb sharp cost increases or pass them on to consumers, neither of which was sustainable in a competitive market. Within weeks, major manufacturers were issuing warnings, delays in production, budget blowouts, postponed investments, and an urgent need to reassess supply routes. Trade partners responded quickly, introducing retaliatory tariffs that directly impacted U.S. exports of agricultural goods, industrial machinery, and finished vehicles. What was meant to secure America's industrial base instead triggered a new cycle of retaliation and retreat. Rather than reshoring, many companies began quietly shifting operations abroad, not out of disloyalty, but out of necessity. Moving production to tariff-exempt regions became a business survival tactic. And instead of ramping up hiring, firms froze job growth, trimmed domestic output, and braced for volatility. The promise of economic nationalism was clear resilience, independence, and blue-collar revival. But the on-the-ground reality has been far more sobering: disrupted growth, stalled factory lines, and wavering investor confidence. Foreign partners now see the U.S. as unpredictable. Domestic producers see their margins evaporate. And workers, the ones this was meant to protect, are left watching as stability slips further out of reach. For many across the automotive and manufacturing sectors, this isn't the revival of American manufacturing. It's a step back from global competitiveness driven not by economic necessity, but by a political narrative that underestimated just how entangled the modern supply chain has become. The political consequences of the tariff-driven economic disruption are no longer hypothetical. They're playing out in real time across the very states that once championed this agenda. In 2025, worker protests and labor walkouts erupted across Michigan, Ohio, Georgia, and Indiana regions, long seen as the heart of American manufacturing. These states were once the symbolic backbone of America. First, the places where promises of revitalized industry and stronger trade protections resonated deeply. But now, as layoffs mount and supply chains seize, the same communities are turning against the policies they once helped elect. Workers on the ground aren't just protesting lost wages, they're expressing anger at being politically misled, told that protectionism would preserve their livelihoods, when in reality it's accelerated their precarity. Union leaders are demanding clarity, compensation, and a rollback of the most damaging tariffs, while small business owners reliant on factory demand and freight movement are sounding the alarm on collapsing local economies. In Washington, the pressure is building. A growing number of bipartisan lawmakers are calling for emergency relief packages, trade exemptions for key sectors, and greater oversight of tariff implementation.
I think auto workers in my state are cheering big time. They finally got a president who's got their backs, going to protect their jobs, raise their wages.
Some Republican representatives, once staunch supporters of Trump's trade agenda, have quietly distanced themselves, citing pressure from constituents facing layoffs, shuttered plants, and economic stagnation. With the 2026 midterm elections looming, these cracks in the political foundation are widening. What was once a message of strength, bringing jobs back, is now being challenged by the cold reality of shrinking payrolls and rising community instability. The backlash isn't coming from coastal critics or rival parties. It's coming from within Trump's own base, from the very voters who were promised protection and instead received pink slips. This is no longer just a policy dispute. It's a crisis of credibility, and it's reshaping the political landscape in America's most economically vulnerable and electorally decisive region. What's happening in the factories isn't staying in the factories. The wave of layoffs in 2025 is sending shockwaves across the broader economic ecosystem, exposing how deeply interconnected modern manufacturing really is. As jobs disappear on assembly lines, the effects ripple outward, hitting logistics companies, trucking firms, parts suppliers, warehouse hubs, and even mom-and-pop businesses that rely on industrial activity to survive. UPS, which recently laid off over 20,000 workers, cited multiple points of stress, cross-border slowdowns, retaliatory tariffs from trade partners like Mexico and Canada, and garage yards overwhelmed with idle freight while inland transport routes face cascading delays. In some regions, unused goods are sitting idle, while transport fleets shrink, not because demand has vanished, but because the routes pricing and policy conditions needed to move them efficiently have broken down. The result is a growing sense of economic fragility. Economists now warn of a policy-induced recession within the U.S. manufacturing sector, one that isn't being driven by automation or technological change, but by instability and uncertainty at the policy level. Investment is slowing, hiring has paused, confidence is evaporating. This is no longer just a debate over trade policy. It's about something much more foundational. Whether companies, workers, and entire communities can trust that the system will hold, or whether it will shift beneath their feet every time the headlines change. Factory by factory, paycheck by paycheck, that trust is eroding. And what's being lost isn't just production, it's stability, strategy, and the belief that the future is something that can still be built at home. This collapse isn't unfolding in global boardrooms or foreign ports. It's happening here in Toledo, in Flint, in Louisville, in the very towns that were promised revival. These are the communities that were told factories would return, wages would rise, and global competition would be held accountable. But nearly halfway through 2025, that vision is unraveling. The jobs that were supposed to come back are disappearing faster than ever. The truth is painfully simple when policy is driven by slogans instead of strategy. It's workers who end up footing the bill. And today, tens of thousands of them are carrying that burden alone in silence, in debt, and too often in disbelief. This isn't just about trade. It's about trust. It's about whether economic decisions are being made to protect headlines or protect livelihoods. And it's about whether anyone is still listening to the voices from factory floors and freight depots, not just campaign donors or consultants. So, ask yourself, who's really winning from this trade war? And more urgently, who's being left behind in its wreckage?